Of all of Buster Keaton's independently made features, The Navigator was his own personal favorite, along with his later acclaimed masterwork, The General. He considered these the best films he ever made. Financially speaking, however, these two films couldn't have been further apart. The Navigator was highly successful upon release, while The General was just the opposite. Though Keaton's fondness for these two films goes beyond the magnificent title props of each picture, in the case of The Navigator, it was clearly his delight to have been able to construct a whole picture due to the fate and happenstance of one of his staff stumbling upon an about-to-be-scrapped ocean liner. Up to this point, Keaton had included numerous comic excursions into bodies of water, using whatever was available, often ingeniously. A horse becomes a rowboat in Hard Luck, as does a drum in The Playhouse. A constantly collapsing canoe turns gondola at the end of The Balloonatic, while a paddle wheel provided him with an iconic tour de force sequence in Daydreams. Of course, two of the shorts, The Boat and The Love Nest, were in a sense dry runs for what was to become in The Navigator. And while further aquatic episodes would take place afterwards in Seven Chances, Battling Butler, and Steamboat Bill Jr., which was actually more about the climactic cyclone than the steamboat, Keaton would never again encounter the sheer seafaring magnitude of his co-star, the SS Buford. In devising a plot for his gargantuan prop, Keaton found himself revisiting his clueless rich persona from the title role of his first feature appearance, The Saphead. Since then, Keaton had proved that he could shift between his somewhat eccentric pork pie everyman character to a urbane sophistication rather seamlessly, as seen in his previous production, Sherlock Jr. This ability would serve him well in The Navigator, as he would rely on it again in Seven Chances, Battling Butler, and continue to revive variants of this character mode throughout his career when plot or story required it. With the pampered, wealthy personas for Keaton and his leading lady from Sherlock Jr., Catherine Maguire, settled upon for the film, all the better to get them on the deserted vessel within the first reel, Keaton and his crackerjack staff of gagmen began devising all manner of situations and visual humor that could be extracted with two people adrift on an ocean liner. All the while, they were careful to straddle the line between the believable and the outlandish, something that the two-reelers that they had recently left behind nearly never required. One particularly celebrated sequence, beautifully choreographed, strikingly photographed, and effectively edited that takes full advantage of the vastness of the ship, is the always managing to miss each other chase between Keaton and Maguire that builds to a crescendo. It's now fairly well known that actor-director Donald Crisp, who was hired to direct the dramatic sequences so Keaton could concentrate on the comic main story, wanted in on the fun, and thus turned, in Keaton's words, gagman overnight on him, making much of his contribution unsatisfactory to Keaton's exacting standards and sense of cinematic balance. So while Crisp went off to much more effectively direct and play the heavy in Douglas Fairbanks Sr.'s Don Q, Son of Zorro, Keaton scrapped and remade much of Crisp's work. Interestingly, Crisp appears in the film as a sight gag, looking very much like his brutal and menacing Battling Burrows character from D.W. Griffith's Broken Blossoms some 5 years earlier, but reimagined as a sea captain's visage in a portrait found on board. An effective kickoff to a series of haunted ghost ship gags, this sequence also seamlessly transforms Keaton's wealthy sap character into his own more familiar man of action and ability character that we know from earlier films via the first appearance of his classic pork pie hat. Rollo Treadway has found his inner Buster. And just in the nick of time, as the rest of the picture will present him with big problems, namely a ship's leak to repair, as well as an island packed with cannibals. While the body of the film took 5 or 6 weeks to shoot, the utterly astounding underwater sequence took another month. In usual Keaton style, following his "so real it hurts" ethos, he insisted that he be the one to perform the dive. He ordered a regulation diver's suit that weighed over 200 pounds, with one interesting and welcome variation. The front panel of glass in the helmet was custom designed and built to reveal his entire face. With a special underwater camera box built, Keaton had planned to shoot the sequence in Catalina waters, where they had already shot much of the onboard material. However, mating season of the fish around the island had begun, and thus the water proved too milky for shooting. A pool in Riverside was secured, and permission to rebuild and extend one end of it deep enough to hold a full-size mock-up of the propeller and rudder of the ship. Upon refilling the pool, the bottom fell out under the weight of the extra water, and Keaton's company had to pay to rebuild it while still needing to find a suitable site to complete the sequence. Lake Tahoe with its crystal clear water was the answer. However, this presented its own difficulties due to the water's freezing temperature. Keaton found he could only manage to stay under for 30 minutes at a time before going numb. The camera box had to be packed with hundreds of pounds of ice to keep it from fogging up with the breath and body heat of the cameramen. At one point, Keaton was amused to find that, thanks to being 20 feet underwater, he was able to move the entire weighted down camera box into position for his cameramen all by himself. During this sequence, Keaton employed surreal and absurdist gags with a lobster and swordfish. Clearly, he felt he was on a roll. He came up with a traffic cop gag involving 1,200 custom-made rubber fish operated by an apparatus, which took tremendous effort, time, and expense to execute. However, when the picture was in previews, the gag garnered no laughs, and Keaton was forced to cut it. Heartbreaking, particularly since Keaton claimed it as his single favorite gag. He came to realize that while appropriate for a two-reeler, it interrupted the dramatic and dire situation that he had set up. He did include the cut gag in the trailer for the film, where it received the belly laughs he had expected. All in all, what appears of the underwater sequence in the finished film amounts to a mere half reel of screen time, but it's some of the most harrowing footage you'll ever experience in a Keaton film. Surviving records of the period indicate that when The Navigator was released in 1924, original theatrical release prints of the film were prepared with multicolored tints, a common practice of the period and an indication of the extra care and showmanship that went into the exhibition of motion pictures. In the case of The Navigator, amber for daytime scenes, blue for nighttime, and green for the underwater scenes. Following these instructions, this edition of The Navigator now reflects this ambient color scheme, not experienced since its initial release. The Navigator is shining proof positive that when Buster Keaton made motion pictures, he ate, slept, and dreamed them.